and welcome back to Crack Build Play. On this week's episode, we have an event review from the recent Foundations pre-release. I was able to attend the pre-release at my local game store and wanted to just give a breakdown of the deck, or in this case, decks that I played during that event, and talk a little bit how that event went overall and how I did, and also just preview the Foundations set here on the channel at a high level. We'll do a full meta breakdown for Foundations later on in a couple of weeks as folks have a chance to play with these new cards, but wanted to just talk briefly about the set itself and then really spend some time talking about how the pre-release went. So before we jump into the decks that I built and how the event itself went, let's talk a little bit about Foundations as a whole. So Foundations is a standard legal set that is going to be legal in standard until at least 2029. This is a simplified set, and it's intended to be a way for players to get introduced and onboarded into Magic the Gathering and have cards that they can use in their standard decks for a while. So it's intended to be sort of the underpinning, the foundation for standard as new sets are released into standard over the next couple of years. With that said, there are a number of returning mechanics in addition to sort of the typical keywords that you'll see. And you'll notice as we go through the cards that each of the keywords has reminder text, where in some of the other more recent sets, those reminder text for things like flying or flash or trample, those don't exist. Again, this is a introductory set. There's a lot of additional product outside of the play boosters and some of the things that if you would open in sort of that limited environment to help folks sort of build up their collection and build up a collection of cards that they can use for building decks moving forward. But there are some returning mechanics. First is flashback. This allows you to cast cards a second time for an additional cost from your graveyard. So you cast it once from your hand, it goes to the graveyard, it has a flashback cost associated with it. You can cast that card a second time for its flashback cost, and then it returns or it gets exiled instead of returning to the graveyard. There's also Threshold. This is an ability. This is an ability that gives an additional value for when you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. So if you're playing self-mill or a graveyard strategy, you can get that graveyard up to at least 7 cards. There's cards with Threshold will have some either grant some additional power or allow you to draw cards or do something special for meeting that condition. There's also Prowess, which gives +1/+1 whenever you cast a non-creature spell. And you'll see in Foundations, along with some of those Prowess cards, there's also some cards that are tied to maybe casting other like specific types of non-creature spells like instants or sorceries. There's also Raid. This is an ability similar to Threshold. In this case, it gives additional value if you've attacked this turn. So a lot of cards will trigger. It will have triggers that if either at end step or in your post-combat main phase or second main phase, if you've attacked, you'll get some additional value. Morbid, which is very similar to Raid, except in this case, it gives an additional value if a creature you control died that turn. And then there's also Landfall, which gives value when a land enters. So some really fun and interesting mechanics, not necessarily ones that are going to be super powerful, but these are sort of mechanics that are core to the things that you're doing in Magic. There's things that interact with the graveyard, things that interact when you're casting spells, things that interact when you attack or when things die or when lands enter. These are all, I think they picked a good set of mechanics when you're talking about a set that's going to be a foundation for a lot of deck building over the next couple of years. In addition to those mechanics, there's a number of different archetypes that they have for the limited environment. So this is for draft and sealed. In this, for Foundations, it's really a return to the classics. A lot of the, if we look back at maybe Duskmourning and Bloomborough before that, a lot of the mechanics were sort of rooted in the color identity, what those colors typically tend to do, but there was some maybe more specific things that each of the color pairs was wanting to do. In this case, this really goes back to the root of Magic, the heart of Magic, and these are very recognizable archetypes. And if you had to guess from the start, if I gave you 2 or 3 guesses to get each one, I imagine you'd get all of the archetypes for the different color pairs. Let's start with the white blue. White blue is flyers, which is typically is usually has some sort of white and blue typically have the most amount of flyers when you look at generally across different sets. But in this case, really leaning into that with cards like Healer's Hawk, Vanguard Seraph, Spectral Sailor, lots of really small, efficient, cost-efficient flyers that you can get out on the board, fill your board up, and just swing out at folks. Blue black is graveyard, so taking advantage of probably some of those morbid threshold capabilities, even flashback in a lot of cases. Cards like Dreadwing Scavenger, Think Twice, which has flashback, Zombify, pulling cards out of your graveyard, Crypt Feaster. And black red is raid, so that's that's the archetype that ties into the raid mechanic. Things like Perforating Artist and Seer Lacer Goblin. These are again getting being aggressive and attacking and not being afraid to attack, and even if that means sort of having some of those cards go to the graveyard. Red green is stompy, so looking at 4+ power big creatures. You got Ruby Daring Tracker, Sower of Chaos, and then Llanowar Elves to help you ramp out those big creatures. Obviously, Llanowar Elves will be useful in a number of different of these archetypes, but really important to focus on when you're trying to get out some big creatures in that red green archetype. White green is counters, so +1/+1 counters. Most part, it's Good Fortune Unicorn, Inspiring Paladin, even Inspiring Call, so you can draw cards. White black life gain. That's a very classic strategy with cards like Vampire Nighthawk, Ajani's Pridemate, both two really strong cards in a life gain strategy, and in particular in this sort of black-white archetype here, also Exemplar of Light. Blue-red is spells. Spells matter. We talked about things that have prowess. There's cards like Elementalist, Adept, Heartfire Immolator, interacts with non-creature spell or instant sorceries. Balmor Battlemage Captain interacts with instants and sorceries, or when instants and sorceries are cast, and then just casting spells like Burst Lightning and things that can remove your opponent's creatures or provide you some value. Black green is morbid, so the morbid mechanic we talked about earlier is the core to the black green strategy. Cards like Weary Thespedian, Treetop Snare Spinner. They've got bunch of cheap removal like Stab, Hungry Ghoul, Burglar Rat, things that mind getting in the graveyard, so that you can trigger those morbid triggers or those morbid abilities. White-red is aggro, which it typically is. Cards like Dauntless Veteran, Heroic Reinforcements are really good at being aggressive and getting in for damage. Goblin Surprise, pump up your creatures and also create more creatures. Blue-green is ramp. Finally, Bushwhack, things like Grow from the Ashes, even Tatiova Benthic Druid as an uncommon in this set, really sort of anchoring the ramp strategy in blue-green here, providing those landfall triggers to be able to draw cards and continue to play lands and things like that. So really classic, straightforward archetypes for this set. Not a lot of surprises, not a lot of deviating from what is sort of like core, or has been core to Magic for a long time. Just want to highlight some key cards that we've seen so far or found. From a removal perspective, there isn't a ton of really efficient, cheap removal. I mentioned Stab before, but there's also Banishing Light in white, Witness Protection in blue, Bake into a Pie in black that also gives you a food token, Bite Down in green. But even when I was playing in the pre-release, one of the things that we found is that you could open packs and not get a lot of great removal. Or if you did have removal, it was removal that was a little bit overcosted and wasn't great at necessarily getting rid of cards, so you could get some board stalls. But I think, so if you're thinking about this from a sealed perspective, prioritizing the removal that you have or prioritizing the decks that you're building around some of that removal might be something you want to think about. In addition to removal, there's a number of big bombs in this set. Bloodthirsty Conqueror is a huge problem. Liliana Dreadhorde General, the return of Liliana in this card is really can take over a game. Curator of Destinies, I added this one from my list personally because I died to it pretty spectacularly in the one of the games I played that we'll talk about in just a few minutes. But even cards like Overrun, if you are able to get a couple of overruns, or you're able to get one of these bombs and consistently play it, that will turn games pretty quickly. There are also some cards that may look good, but I think are definitely traps. Cards like Doubling Season, Rise of the Dark Realms, Painful Quandary. These are cards that I think look good, but ultimately we're going to find out that as the sort of meta goes on, these are not good cards to play in this environment. There isn't necessarily enough token or +1/+1 counter synergy to run a 5-mana Doubling Season, Rise of the Dark Realms. Even though there are a lot of graveyard synergies, it's just too much mana, and Painful Quandary isn't fast enough for, I think, how this meta is going to eventually play out. Some things I wanted to highlight just before we jump into the decks that I built and talking about the event itself. I think unlike Duskborn specifically, and maybe more like Bloomborough in the past, I think there are only very small pockets of overlap and or synergy between the archetypes in this meta so far, or at least in this sealed environment. The cards themselves, a lot of them are sort of generically meant to sort of, again, serve as that foundation. But when you look at how they play together, there are only a handful of those synergies where you can maybe get flyers that also have lifelink, or cards that have that are 4 power or toughness or larger, and also have some of the raid triggers and want to be attacking. There's so there are some synergies you can find, but they're only in small pockets. Other thing to highlight is there are I think there's a couple of 2-card combos in the deck itself, or in the card pool itself, that if you're able to open, they are like sort of instant win 2-card combos. I think at least one of them involves Bloodthirsty Conqueror, but I think there's at least one more. So that's just something to look out for as you're building your decks. Again, you obviously have to open both cards of that combo. This isn't draft where you can potentially draft them, but just something to be wary of and consider. And there's also some sub-synergies within some of the colors, where, for example, in green, the decks that have green in them, there's a sort of slight sub-theme of elves. There's cats in white, and wizards in blue, goblins in red. Flash as well, across a couple of different colors. You could do some synergies with Flash. So also want to be looking out for those sort of things as well. I've seen some folks put together some relatively impactful elves themed decks or elf ball decks from their card pools, just because they just happen to open enough of the important elves. So just things to look out for and keep an eye on as you're opening packs and looking to build from your sealed pool. Overall, I think the event, the pre-release itself, I had a ton of fun. So I think the format is going to be will be relatively bomb dependent. There's a big gap between some of the really, really good cards in the set and some of the other cards you could open in your packs. Like there's some disparity between the rares and mythics that you could open versus the ones you might open in your particular pool. But I think it does feel very old school from a Magic perspective, sort of back to the basics, and focusing on putting together decks that seem a lot simpler than maybe we have been used to or trying to build from in recent sets. So let's move on and talk a little bit about the overall experience that I had at the Foundation's pre-release. Again, I went to a pre-release event on Sunday of pre-release weekend. There were about 15 or 16 folks who participated at my local game store, so a relatively good turnout, especially for a Sunday. My game store has a number of different ways to play on pre-release weekend, from a competitive event to a premium event where they're giving away collector's boosters and include collector's boosters in your sealed pool. This was just their traditional sealed pre-release event, 3 rounds. 3 rounds throughout the event, and prizes based off of wins. So a relatively casual event, relatively casual attendees. So when we think about my overall card pool, as I was opening it, the first thing that jumped out at me, and the first deck that I built, was blue-white flyers. I had a number of good flyers in the first couple of packs. I opened a Healer's Hawk, which I'm always going to be thinking about playing, and I opened a couple of other good blue cards that to me sort of jumped out. I easily said, okay, I can make a deck out of this, and it will be relatively good. It'll be playable. It'll be something that will be at least competitive and fun to play. So I just started with that. As I opened packs sort of 3, 4, and 5, I also realized that I had probably a pretty good deck in at least red and green, and potentially more. So I decided to continue to sort of go through and evaluate my full card pool, built this blue-white deck to start, and then took another sort of second look at the rest of the cards that I had left over to see what I could get out of them, and realized I think I had enough cards for a second deck. So I've talked about this before. For pre-release weekend specifically, I like to get the most out of the card pool that I possibly can, so I decided to make 2 decks. We'll get into the specific deck breakdowns here in a second, but I think overall because there's enough of a split between the color pairings and not a ton of overlap between maybe shared colors, there is an opportunity to build multiple decks from a card pool if you open enough, obviously, of each of those colors. So let's start with deck 1, which was the Flyers deck. And if we start sort of from the top here, I think you'll see that the Flyers that I had available to me really sort of drove the building this deck, starting with sort of Dazzling Angel. Whenever another creature enters, you gain 1 life. It's a 2/3 flyer for 3. Vanguard Seraph, whenever you gain life for the first time each turn, Surveil 1, it's a 3/3 flyer. Healer's Hawk has flying and lifelink. So there's sort of this Flyers theme, at least in white, with also sort of that sub-theme of life gain. That's really something I wanted to lean into. Spectral Sailor, a 1-mana flash flying card that eventually you can draw cards. Strix Lookout is 1 and a blue for flying and vigilance. It's only a 1/2, but having vigilance, especially in the late game when there are also a bunch of other flyers that are on the board, and being able to block, or I would keep this up as a blocker, but still be able to attack if they've attacked with all of their flyers is what was not nothing. And being able to draw a card and discard a card later, you'll see I maybe tried to lean into that a little bit too much when we go show some of the cards that I put into this deck. I might have swapped out or played a little bit differently if I in hindsight. Included Balmor Battle Mage Captain. I had 1 dual land. Let's go here. I had 1 dual land at a Swiftwater Cliffs that could tap for red and blue. So I decided to include this. This was probably a mistake. 1, because I don't think I had enough instance to ever really consistently trigger Balmor's ability. It's only a 1/3 flyer. I often, in too many games, this got stuck in my hand and I was never actually able to play it. So moving on, but it was a flyer. It was blue. Could splash red. It didn't seem like that much of a detriment to sort of include it in the deck, and so I decided to include it anyways. Those flyers were sort of key to me sort of starting down that path, and then I also looked at the removal that I had in across my entire pool, and you'll see in deck 2 a lot of that removal was in black, but I did have some good removal in blue-white. So Uncharted Voyage puts a creature on either on the top or bottom of owner's library. I did have a Banishing Light. I did have a Witness Protection. Those 2 came in clutch a couple of times. And then Big Fin Bouncer, being a blue card that allows me to bounce a creature and is also a 3/2. That's really actually was pretty impactful to sort of swing a board state, at least in one game during the event. Quick Draw Katana, again, just gives some added power to some of my flyers, and also gives them first strike on my turn, so could get some extra damage in there for things like the Healer's Hawk. That goes from gaining 1 life a turn to gaining 3 life a turn, which was important. Twin Blade Blessing was a combat trick that not a lot of people saw coming, if I'm being honest. Being able to flash this in and give the creature double strike, I could gain twice as much life. I could be able to block one of their creatures and deal first strike damage and save my creature. It ended up being pretty good. Fleeting Flight was one of the best protection spells, at least in the rounds that I played. I was always wary if somebody was holding up 1 white mana and I had a flyer that was going ready to attack, that they might play a Fleeting Flight, block my creature, or even kill my creature, and prevent all combat damage to their creature so they could swing back on the crackback. Refute, it's a counterspell that draws cards. I think it was only relevant in one of my games. Helpful Hunter is really just an efficient creature to draw a card. And then we get sort of in where I think I made a little bit of a mistake. I included Erudite Wizard and Mischievous Mystic. Mischievous Mystic at least flies. It is a 1 and a blue for a 2/1 flyer. But both of these cards say whenever you draw your second card, do something. The Mischievous Mystic draws a card. The Erudite Wizard, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. I think these 2 cards were a mistake for this deck. Maybe not the flyer, just to have another blue flyer, but they never really got to the point where I could consistently draw a second card on any turn. I think if you were building your deck specifically around that, looking at card draw, you could do that, but I never got to the point where I could do that this time. Guarded Air has lifelink and creates 2 3/3 white knight creature tokens. This was just a sort of a late game play to get an additional card with lifelink and get some additional power on the field if I needed it. Resolute Reinforcements. This actually ended up doing work by sort of creating multiple blockers on an opponent's turn, being able to come down and immediately have 2 creatures that you can use to block or either chump block or block together to kill a creature. Definitely punched above its weight for sure. Heir Apparent. This was another one that I think was a mistake going in this deck. I only have 1. I didn't realize that it didn't trigger on itself. It only triggered on other Heir Apparents. So I thought it was similar to Resolute Reinforcements. It is not. So that was something probably in hindsight I would take out. Arabo, the First Fang, again, hoping to maybe potentially get some extra tokens out of this. I did have I think a handful of other potential casts, but again, another creature to sort of fill out the deck. Aegis Turtle punched way above its weight. Oftentimes, if this came down on turn 1, I felt pretty safe in this format for a couple of turns, so that was definitely great. And Tolarian Terror, while I didn't have a ton of instants to be able to reduce this spell costs at all or hardly at all, these games did go long enough where I could get to 6 or 7 mana and cast this for that, for sure. Then, like I said, I won Swiftwater Cliffs and some basic lands. Overall, I think from this card pool, if I was to do this again, I think I still would definitely make that blue-white flyer deck. I might have swapped a couple of different cards in for those ones that I said I didn't think were super valuable. The ones that I had considered and made sort of like the final cuts were Self-Reflection, which allows you to create a copy of target creature you control. It has flashback, so you could do that like twice. The flashback cost is cheaper, so if you discard it to the Strix Lookout, you can cast it for cheaper later. And then Squad Rallier was one that I completely misread, and if I had to do this all over again, would definitely include this in the deck. I'll talk about in one of the rounds. This was really impactful for my opponent, and I wish I would have noticed that you didn't have to tap this creature. It was just, the cost was just 2 and a white for you to activate its ability, which is, look at the top 4 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card with power 2 or less from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in any order. So this is a 4 mana 3/4, which on its own is a good blocker. But being able to activate that ability in the late game and essentially draw either an attacking flyer or a flyer that can help you block if you need it, saved one of my opponents, helped them win one game, and I wish I would have read that card a little bit more closely and swapped out one of those cards. I would have swapped out for that one in my deck for sure. So that's deck one. If we look at deck two, really the thing that made me want to, or made me think I could build this deck was the removal that I had in these colors. So starting with Slagstorm, being able to deal 3 damage to each creature or to each player. That 3 damage to each creature, there is a lot of creatures, like small creatures in this set that can just wipe a board very quickly. For 3 mana, you can wipe every creature on the board and maybe just have a handful of either your opponents to clean up, or if you're playing big creatures like this deck is, yours stay alive. Felling Blow, one of the better, or one of the only, really, one of the only actual, maybe potential remover spells in green, being able to put a +1/+1 counter on one of your creatures and have it deal damage. So it's not a fight, so you don't have to worry about your creature dying. It just deals damage to target creature and opponent controls. Bake into a pie destroys the target creature and creates a food token. It's 4 mana, which typically is a lot, but again, in a set where there's not a ton of efficient removal, this ends up being pretty good. Involuntary Employment isn't directly removal, but it allows you to gain control of a target creature until end of turn. Untap that creature, it gains haste, so you can take away one of your opponent's blockers when you're attacking, and hopefully attacking for lethal. And if you don't kill your opponent, you can still create a treasure token before that creature goes back to them. So it goes back to them tapped if you attack. So there's an opportunity for you to do some other things with that. Eaten Alive. This is probably one of the more efficient removal spells that allows you to exile a target creature or planeswalker. You can either sacrifice a creature or pay 3 and a black. So regardless, you're going to be able to exile one of your opponent's creatures. It just how efficiently you're able to do that depends on whether or not you have a board. And then having some creatures in this deck that are totally okay being sacrificed, or even be preferred to be sacrificed. This was definitely a good card for that. Stab, target creature gets -2/-2 until end of turn. Just efficient, especially, again, not a lot of removal in the packs that I had. This can take out a lot of the smaller creatures, or allow you to take out a bigger creature if you've blocked with one of your creatures that you don't mind dying. I also opened a Llanowar Elves. And then I opened a Vivian Reed. Vivian, again, this probably was a bit of a trap. She wasn't that good in the deck, but you have a Planeswalker, you might as well include it in your deck, just even to try to distract people from attacking you, potentially. But being able to, again, this is essentially removal, being able to destroy artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. There's also the ability to look at the top 4 cards of your library. You can reveal a creature or land card from among them and put it into your hand, put the rest on the bottom. So that gets you to the creatures that you want to be playing. And again, always having a planeswalker when you have the option is important. Treetop Snare Spinner is one of, and I think this has been proven out if you look at discourse across the internet, one of the cards that is surprisingly impactful. It has reach, so again, with the fact that flyers are pretty prevalent, it's a 1/4 that has reach and death touch, which means it kills anything in the air. It deals 1 damage, and then it has a late game mana sink where you can pay 2 and a green to put a +1/+1 on target creature you control. You have to activate it only as a sorcery, so you can't do it on their turn in response or during blocking or before blocking. But being able to, any mana that you have that you're just not using late in the game, but buff up your creatures, even the Snare Spinner. It's way better than I think people might have originally thought. I think people are sort of caught on to how good this card actually is. I'd take a whole deck full of these cards. Eager Truffle Snout is 2 and a green for a 4/2 boar with trample, and it also has whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, create a food token. That food token comes in handy, especially as this deck is a little bit slower. So some of the more aggressive decks are able to sort of chip away at my life total, and then late in the game I can deal damage to some of these bigger creatures and then get that food token. Slumbering Cerberus doesn't untap during your untap step, but it has Morbid that says at the beginning of each end step, if a creature died this turn, untap this creature. In a lot of cases in this deck, I was okay with my creatures dying, or there was creatures that I'm fine sacrificing. There's also other decks that I was playing that were fine sacrificing creatures, so this untapped pretty regularly. Shivan Dragon, I put this in there because I wanted to play Shivan Dragon, and it has flying, and it's a 5/5, and you can give it +1/+0 until end of turn. I've never played in a draft environment or in a sealed environment where Shivan Dragon was there, so I wanted to include it. Affectionate Indrik, when it enters, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. Again, it's another potential removal spell. For 6 mana, yes, but you can leave behind a 4/4 body. I think that is good enough, especially when I'm playing a deck that is that 4 power is relevant. Apothecary Stomper is 4 and 2 green for 4/4 with Vigilance. It says when it enters, choose one, put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, or gain 4 life. That 4 life isn't nothing, but most of the time you're going to put those +1/+1 counters on it. Gorehorn Raider, 4 and a red. When this creature enters, if you attack this turn, this creature deals 2 damage to any target. Again, removal. The Gutless could be removal, could be the last 2 damage. It is a big creature. Gutless Plunder has Death Touch and Raid. When it enters, you can look at the top 4 or 3 cards of your library. You can put one of them on top and the rest in their graveyard, so you can fill the graveyard for some of the other. I had some Threshold and Graveyard Synergy stuff that we'll get to in a second. Goblin Borders was another card with Raid. When it enters with a +1/+1 counter if you attack this turn. So almost always going to be a 4/3 for 3, which is pretty great. Abyssal Harvester, I think, is turning into one of the better cards of the set, but I never had a real opportunity to cast it or play it. But it's an interesting card. It's 1 and 2 black for a 3/2, but it has a tap ability that says tap, exile target creature card from a graveyard that was put there this turn, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a nightmare in addition to its other types, then exile all other nightmare tokens you control. So you can essentially get a copy of either your creature or your opponent's creature that goes into the graveyard. I thought this was going to be really fun to play with. I just didn't get a chance to play it in the games that I played in this event. Burglar Rat, great at dying. When it enters, opponent discards a card. It's a 1/1 that you're going to play to get your opponent to discard a card and then immediately sacrifice it in the block. Crypt Feaster has Menace and Threshold, so some of those other cards that are putting cards into your graveyard also interact with this one. So having Menace and being able to attack as a 5/4 essentially was pretty good late game for sure. Infestation Stage, this is another one, wants to die. When it dies, you get a 1/1 black and green insect creature token with flying. I was almost ready and wanting this to die in a lot of cases to block and deal with some of the flyers that my opponents would have, but the opponents would just let it swing in for 1, so kind of chip away for 1 over and over again. Wary Thespian, another one that wants to die. When it enters or dies, you surveil 1. Gets more cards in the graveyard. Axguard Cavalry. This card did work, and it actually, I'll talk about it in a little bit, it actually helped me win a game for sure. But it is 1 and a red for a 2/2, and it says tap, target creature gains haste until end of turn. That doesn't seem like much, but when you're dropping like 4 power and toughness or greater creatures that get to swing in right away and instead of potentially getting removed before you get to attack, it was definitely impactful in the games that I played. Then in this deck, I had a rugged Highlands and a Jungle Hollow, and then some basic mountains, swamps, and forests. This deck, I had a lot more cards that could potentially go in the card pool for this deck. One of the cards that I probably wished I would have put in, and maybe should have slotted in after one of the games that I played, was the Sower of Chaos. I also had another Gorehorn Raider, but the Sower of Chaos, I think, would have given me an opportunity potentially to get in some more damage if I would have included it. And after sort of looking at how this card has been sort of evaluated like after that pre-release weekend. I think I should have included it in the deck. Probably also should have included this Gorehorn Raider. I think it could have easily swapped something else out for this. Gnarlid Colony was another one I thought about. Same with Revenge of the Rats. I think this Revenge of the Rats is really good. I just preferred to play some of the beefier creatures in this particular strategy. Had a Giant Growth that I thought about including. Pilfer, if I wanted to go a little bit more towards control, maybe focus on like that Burglar Rats a little bit more. Mild Mannered Librarian I thought about because it can become a 3/3 and draw a card, but it's a 1-mana 1/1. I had a Goblin Surprise, a Swiftfoot Boots. This Garruk's Uprising I really thought about for a long time because I had a number of creatures that have 4 power or greater. Giving them Trample would have been interesting, but I just don't think there was enough. Essentially wasting 3 mana, what it would feel like to waste 3 mana to do nothing, what I think would have been not great. Then I also had a Painful Quandary, which, like I said, I think is a trap, and a Phyrexian Arena, which I also could have played, but it could be doing something more impactful than just that. So those were the 2 decks. The cards that didn't make it in, I thought about maybe including this Elenda Saint of Dusk for some of those other life link synergies. This Brineborn Cutthroat almost made it, but I didn't really have any ways to cast spells on other people's turns. And the only other one, the Scrawling Crawler, was one I really sat on for a long time in both decks. It's colorless, it doesn't really matter. But I think if I would have thought a little bit more about the drawing your second card a turn strategy in this one and built a little bit more around that, I probably would have included the Crawler for sure. And then the rest of these have some synergies with other things that I just didn't have a lot of support for. The Inspiring Call, I didn't have a lot of +1/+1 counters. Wasn't really focusing on raid all that much. Incinerating Blast, thought about it, but for 5 mana just to steal 6 damage, I think I was trying to swing in at that point a lot of the times. So not a lot of great power in the rest of those decks. I didn't really have a lot of big bomby cards. I think the decks that I was able to build were more about like incremental, like grind it out sort of value, or get under under what they were doing with this blue-white deck, and that's sort of how it played out, and ultimately the way the games went, sort of as things went on. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how the 3 rounds went. In the first round, I played an opponent whose deck was basically a mirror of mine, except it was more black-white than it was white-blue. I think they played Esper. They played 3 colors, but the majority of their deck was black and white. In the first game, these were really slow, grindy games. All 3 of them were really. But the first game started with me having a Aegis Turtle and a Healer's Hawk in my hand. Both of those kept me alive for a very, very long time. I was able to eventually draw the Quick Draw Katana and equipped it to the Healer's Hawk, so I was gaining that 3 life a turn. He was only able to attack me for either 4 or 3 or 4 damage, so it was really just keeping my life total pretty much stable. For the longest time, I was able to draw into some removal. I was able to draw into a couple of my removal and get through a couple of his creatures. But then he cast that Squad Rallier and used it multiple times. And I wasn't able to do enough damage or attack with enough creatures to bring his life total down fast enough. And eventually he was able to get a Vampire Nighthawk on the battlefield with a Sky Knight Squire, and those 2 just continued to chip away at me over time. Eventually he removed the turtle, which meant that I had to block with more of my creatures on my next turn, and eventually I just ran out of gas, and he took game 1. In game 2, I drew the Hawk again in my opening hand. I drew a lot more of my flyers. He was stuck without white mana for most of the game and didn't draw as many of his good black cards. Eventually, I just sort of overran him with Tolarian Terror and Flyers again. It took a long time because I basically just had a bunch of 1 power or 2 power Flyers that I was chipping away with, and he was chipping sort of back, so it went back and forth a little bit. But eventually got the Tolarian Terror down and enough Flyers that I could continuously swing, and over a couple of turns was able to take him down. There was something, one of the really funny thing that happened in this game. He was stuck on white mana. I was able to sort of hold on to my refute, and eventually, after maybe 5 or 6 turns, he was able to play a plains and tapped out to play a big white creature that I immediately countered with refute that I was saving specifically for that reason. And actually getting that refute in my graveyard was one of the things that helped me play the Tolarian Terror on my next turn. That ultimately allowed me to sort of keep attacking in. But being able to hold on to that and just I was sort of waiting, and he knew I was waiting, and it was a funny interaction, a funny moment from that game for sure. Game 3 was very similar to game 1. I started with both the turtle and the hawk. I actually mulled to 6, but had both in my hand with a white mana and a blue mana, and was able to play them both on sort of subsequent turns. My opponent didn't have a great opening hand. I was able to sort of chip away, again, 1 damage at a time, staying at 20 life for multiple turns. He was sort of going down from 18 to 17 to 16 as I was staying at 20, and because he was attacking me with, at that point, I think he was attacking me with 2 creatures, and one of them only had 1 power. Eventually, I ran out of gas, similar to I did in game 1. His squad rallier drew him several creatures again. The board was slowly starting to shift, but then we went to the end of the round and went to turns. I was able to play just enough blockers to sort of stabilize, and there wasn't really a clear winner. My life total was a lot higher than his. He might be able to continue to chip me down, but we ended the game as a draw. So that end of the game and the round is a draw because we went 1-1 and 1 in those rounds. So after round 1, I was 0-0 and 1, having drawn that first round. In deck 2, I switched to my second deck. I was playing an opponent who had a black-green white deck. His deck was mostly green-white counters. It had a tiny bit of an elf sub theme that he was sort of splashing black to play Lathril and a couple of the black removal spells. In the first game, I was really stuck without green mana. I had red and black. I was able to play a couple of red creatures to stay alive for a little while, and was able to cast a Slag Storm that cleared the board and kept me alive for definitely longer than it should have, but I never drew into a green source the entire game and died pretty quickly. In game 2, this was probably our most competitive game. It was a lot of back and forth early. I was able to use a stab and a bake into a pie early to keep his board relatively clear. He started to get a board of small creatures, Llanowar Elves, and a couple of other smaller creatures. I had a Slag Storm and an Eaten Alive in my hand that the Slag Storm was just sort of waiting to play to see how many less than 3 toughness creatures he ended up putting out on the board, trying to get sort of maximum value out of that. He ended up playing Galta, so he ended up getting enough creatures on the board that had, I think, around 8 or 9 toughness total, and ended up playing a Galta. And at that point, I'm like, okay, I gotta fire off this Slag Storm. I gotta use this Eaten Alive. On my turn, I was able to attack. I dealt some damage because he didn't block at all. I think he was worried that I had combat tricks in my hand, like the potentially giant growth or something like that. And I cast the Eaten Alive, sacking one of my smaller creatures, and then cast Slag Storm to clear the rest of the board. The Eaten Alive killing or exiling his Galta. After I cleared the board, I was able to rebuild faster, and then thanks to that Axeguard Cavalier, which, like I said, came in clutch a couple of different times, I was able to give some of those creatures that I was playing haste, and was just able to get damage in quicker than he was, and able to take game 2. Game 3, we started playing and noticed really quickly that my opponent, I think he mulliganed down to 5, and then still didn't have a great hand. ended up being pretty mana screwed. I was able to just sort of play my creatures without much interaction from him, and I won that game pretty quickly without a whole lot of effort. So it was really kind of a tale of two mana screwed games with one really competitive game in the middle that I wish we would be able to play a couple more like that. So I took round two. At this point, I'm 1-0-1. Haven't lost a round yet, but probably definitely could have lost round one, and round two was pretty competitive as well. In round three, I decided to go back to deck one, and I was playing an opponent who had a white, blue, red, a Jeskai deck that was really, really good. I think he ended up having two Curative Destinies, and I got absolutely stomped in both games. Game one, I had a turn one Healer's Hawk. Healer's Hawk in your opening hand is what, it must be a guaranteed thing or something like that. But it was a house the entire afternoon. Was kept me alive a lot of times. Was able to just chip in for damage, play a flyer, blocks. Well, late game is just it's a really good card, especially in that blue white flyers deck. If you have, and especially if you have, even more especially if you have a life game theme, sub theme. And the opponent played a Sear Slicer Goblin early on, and that card pumped out goblins like nobody's business. Because you don't have to attack with a goblin, even when I got blockers that could kill it, he could still attack with something else that was either bigger, or you could attack with one of the tokens and make another token. So he was always able to attack with something. And I didn't draw enough of my removal to get rid of that card early on or get rid of it for good. Eventually, he played Curator of Destinies. I decided to give him the face-up cards. The next turn, he played another Curator of Destinies. And eventually I just overrun by flyers. I did not have enough card advantage or enough flyers to sort of keep up with those 5/5s. This was the game where like Strix Lookout early on especially really put in more work than I expected it to. Again, with it having Vigilance, you can do the tap, draw, discard at the end of your opponent's turn. It can sit there as a blocker. It being a 1/2, I was able to sort of hold up and potentially a potential block for the 1/1 tokens that the Sear Slicer Goblin was creating. So and still tap it and draw a card and discard a card. Without that, I think this game would have been a lot worse, but it was still pretty bad. Game two was a tiny bit closer. I was able to equip the Healer's Hawk with a Quick Draw Katana. I didn't have my Healer's Hawk in my opening hand, but I drew it pretty early. So I took out some of the creatures I could attack with it without worrying about it dying pretty consistently, and I flashed in a Twin Blade Blessing to really get my life total up there. And then my opponent killed my Hawk the next turn, played a Curator of Destinies, and I had no flyers. And in a blue-white flyers deck, couldn't find one that I could draw in time, and he basically just beat me over the head with a 5/5 flyer over the course of a couple of turns. So overall ended 1-1-1. I don't think I really had the top end cards that I needed to like really, really compete in this format. I think my first deck, the Flyers deck, was a little bit more power, or was a little bit better deck overall. I think deck two had more removal and with a little bit more fixing would have been more powerful than that first deck and would have had enough top end to be able to compete with some of the better decks that folks were able to build. But I think there was no way I was beating that deck in game or in round three. It was just had too much beef for me to compete with. Had too many good cards for me to compete with. So, but overall, yeah. Again, it was a great weekend or a great event. I think I had a lot of fun. I think Foundations I've had a chance to play a couple of sealed events since then, and I've been having fun. I think we'll see how the rest of this particular meta plays out, and we'll review it more in our meta review here in a couple of weeks. But I think it's fun. It feels like old school Magic in a lot of ways. There's still definitely some cards that can swing games more than others, but I think overall it feels back to the basics, and is something that will be fun to play for new folks and folks who are experienced alike. So that's it for today. If you're interested in a review of a meta, go and check out our last video where we talked through the Duskmourn meta, some of the key cards for sealed, a breakdown of some of the different archetypes and how they've been performing, and looked at my top 10 cards for that format. Upcoming, we're going to have a Bloomburrow sealed deck build. We're going to take it back a couple of sets and look at that format and have an opportunity to put a sealed deck from there. We might also talk about some of the decks that I built and how I was successful in other events for Bloomburrow. We'll also be doing that Foundations meta review here in the future, and we'll have more Foundations sealed deck build videos here as this format rolls on. So thanks again for everybody for joining. We'll see you next time.